So what we're going to talk today is we're going to talk today about East Africa. East Africa is an interesting place. It has a lot of history behind it. We're going to focus on Ethiopia, Tanzania, and then Kenya. So let's get a move on. So in Ethiopia, in the textbook that we're talking about, we're going to talk mainly about the two religions that are important in Ethiopia. And then also we're going to talk about the contrast between the daily lives of rural and urban Ethiopians. So Ethiopia has both a large Muslim and a large Christian population. There are many Christian monasteries, and the religious language that is spoken is called Ge'ez, and that's just a language that's spoken almost exclusively these days for religious purposes. And Ethiopia, it's in the Horn of Africa, so it has this area right here. If you look up here, we have Eritrea. Over here we have Somalia. We have Kenya right here. So there's a lot of different areas that are involved in there. So if you remember, we talked about, well here, in terms of Ethiopia, here we go. If you remember, we talked about Kibkab in the video we watched about the Festival of the Epiphany. That's called Timkat in the Ethiopian faith. And that's the highlight of the religious calendar. And also about the young man who was making money shining shoes in Addis Ababa so he could send the money home for his village festival. So that's just a reminder there. Now, Ethiopian Christianity, it was adopted early on from Alexandria in Egypt. Alexandria practiced a different form of Christianity than was practiced in the Rome or Constantinople. By 451 AD, the Egyptians had actually separated from the rest of the Christian church and formed the Coptic Christian church. So the isolation of Ethiopia made it even more different because once the Muslims took over a lot of the land around Ethiopia, they weren't able to communicate with the Egyptian Coptic church, and so it even made it more isolated, and they developed their own series of traditions. And if you look, there's the mountains of Ethiopia, which obviously are hard to get through. And one of the main reasons why Ethiopia has never really been effectively colonized, or never was really effectively colonized or conquered until it came to the Italians shortly in World War II. Now, the Muslim faith did take over quite a bit of the area because of the trade routes that were established once Islam started to move on out of Saudi Arabia. And over time, many people converted to Islam. Now, the numbers kind of today are close to the ones that are listed there. About 43% is Orthodox Christianity, about 34% Muslim, and Protestant around 19%. So quite a few Christians, but also quite a few Muslims there too. So if you look, obviously that map there, it shows the amount of Muslims around the world, and there are obviously quite a few of them. Now, sometimes the groups have fought, but not very much recently. For the most part, they now live together relatively peacefully. Thankfully so, as opposed to in other countries where still they're fighting. Now, in terms of ways of life, Lalibela and Addis Ababa are very different. Lalibela is rural, has no electricity. Most of the people are farmers. Addis Ababa is a modern city with running water, electricity, hospitals. There's still some more traditional areas of the city, but still, it's a relatively modern city. And that's, if you visualize the churches that are carved out, those are the ones that are from Lalibela, so it's very striking and important sites that people still visit today. Now, for Section 2, Tanzania, the objectives for the section were to find out how the early reforms that the government of Tanzania made after independence, and then to learn about the continued social, economic, and political progress and reforms that have been made in Tanzania. We're going to tackle those by looking first of all at Tanzania's earlier history from before independence. For most of the last 2,000 years, it was ruled firstly by Arabs, and then by Germans, and then by the British. Its location on the Indian Ocean made it relatively easy to travel to, again, the Indian Ocean right here. And there's Dar es Salaam, there's Zanzibar. And until the Germans, it was a part of German East Africa. Under the British, it was called Tanganyika, and after it became independent and then later combined with Zanzibar, the island of Zanzibar formed Tanzania. So the first leader of independent Tanzania was a guy named Julius Nyerere, and once it became independent, he knew that there were probably going to be problems with the ethnic groups and within the country, so he tried to focus to make sure that that would not be the case by making sure that that there was only one party system, and we're going to get to that in a second, but he focused on literacy and really focused on the idea of how do you go ahead and get everybody to work together. So one of the ways he did that was by having Swahili as the national language. Some of the people, or some of his policies were approved by people at home and abroad, but others were not. His country adopted Swahili as the national language, and one of the reasons why he did that was because a lot of people knew Swahili as sort of a second language as opposed to their native tongue, their native language that they used. So a lot of people knew it. It was sometimes called the lingua franca by the people who spoke, groups who spoke different languages could also speak it to each other. It made it one ethnic group unlikely to dominate the others because they kind of all knew Swahili. And he wanted this one-party system, so other nations, he'd seen the fighting that had happened, so he decided that there would only be one political party, and people ran against each other in that one political party. Some complain that this led to quite a bit of corruption, which is kind of the problem when you have one-party rule, and you can see that today in some countries like China even. There are allegations of corruption there. So in terms of economics, they had this phrase called uhuru na kazi, which means freedom and work. It meant that hard work would lead to an end to poverty. And he wanted the country to be self-reliant. He called on people to live in these things called Ujamaa villages, which were where the government could provide the services that were needed, and people would share and work together. Some people moved to these places willingly, others were forced to move there. And it's still, there was some success and some failure, but Tanzania was still poor when Nyerere stepped down. Education improved, but the economy was still poor, and the Ujamaa program did not work well. So how do you fix that? Well, the new leaders, they came in and they said, let's get rid of the Ujamaa villages. It was an interesting experiment, but it's not working too well. So there's more of a focus also on cash crops they led to, and less and the idea of selling those outside of Tanzania. And foreign countries, borrowing money from foreign countries, and now they also have a multi-party system. So these are big changes as opposed to being the one-party self-sufficient country that it was before. When he stepped down, he in 1985, he continued to work with the government. He tried to solve some of the problems with other countries in Africa. And again, really admirably, he retired to a village and lived very simply, and he died there in 1999. So if you remember in the video, we watched the soccer players from Zanzibar, Isa, and the reliance of the people on the ocean there, and the differences between their village and Dar es Salaam. This is the Tanzanian coat of arms, and if you see up here, it's you can pause it here if you want to read through this whole thing. Not going to go through all of it, but the gold represents the riches of the country. This is the Tanzanian flag. The red is the red earth. Then we've got the coastline represented by the waves. We've got the implements that we'd use in farming, and an axe and a hoe there. We've got elephant tusks. We've got uhuru na umoja, which is the phrase that was used by them, which means freedom and unity. And just give an idea, a very powerful sort of idea here of something, and you see men and women working together. So section 3, the objectives from the reading are to learn about the people of Kenya, to discover what life is like in rural Kenya, and then discover what life is like in urban Kenya. And we're going to skip over this because we didn't watch that video. But in terms of geography and the people, some mountains and much of the area has a high elevation, just like in most of Africa it has a high elevation, but in Kenya in particular. It gets plenty of rain and is good for farming in a lot of areas. But further inland, it's more dry, and it's more like a savanna, sort of like the Lion King, if you imagine that. Some desert even further to the north. People live in small family farms called shambas. And there's many different people. A few people who live in Kenya are not from Africa. There's many different ethnic groups. The biggest group is the Kikuyu. And then these other groups as well are part of that too. Again, not a lot of Europeans, Asians, or Arabs. Most people are Christian or Muslim, 45% and Protestant, 33% Roman Catholic, and only 10% Muslim. So that's a little bit different than some places that you might expect on the Swahili coast here. So again, we have a Somali majority over here. We got a mix of different groups here. We got the Kikuyu over here. So again, a lot of different groups. one of the things that's really important to understand about the value of land to the people of Kenya, to the Kikuyu and people like that, it's really viewed as something that's important to them and a part of their lives. And the village is where people are from, even if they move to the city. They consider it that way. Now, Harambee, when Kenya got independence in 1963 from Britain, the new country president was a guy named Jomo Kenyatta, and he started what was called Harambee, which meant let's pull together. And the government tries to help, but also doesn't do all of it. Like schools, they didn't provide money for them or very much money for them, but they encouraged people to work together to hire school teachers and to set up schools. In terms of rural areas, most of the people are farmers, and most of the farmers are women. The men farm too, but there's a mix of cash and subsistence crops along with herding of animals. And you can see again this area here where you got desert and scrub brush, the savanna over here, and so really down here is the place where you probably want to be more than anywhere. Um, so. In terms of moving to the city, most women and children stay in the rural areas, and many men and some women move to the city. It's cheaper just for the family to stay in the farm. Most of the families stay in the farm, and for the husband to go ahead and try and earn extra money. Now, modern day cities they do have those, like in Nairobi and places like matatus. These are these buses that were used and brightly colored and decorated. And modern conveniences, things just like in Addis Ababa, where sanitation, all those things that we would expect from a modern city. And again, the men who move to the city are generally homesick. They're mainly doing it to earn money to buy more land, often share rooms with people from their own group, from their own ethnic group. Women are left on the farm, have to work kind of twice as hard, so it's kind of harsh on them with the men being gone. And women do work together in self-help groups to try and solve some problems in the community. And when the women do meet, they try to help make decisions for the community as well. Kenya is actually the name. It means it's named after Mount Kenya, and it's called similar. It's called something similar to this in most languages in the area, which means the place of ostriches. And apparently, when you view this mountain peak, Mount Kenya, from a distance, it can look like ostrich feathers. That's what the snow does. In addition, don't forget to remember the stuff that we talked about in terms of Rwanda and Darfur. And we didn't really talk about Libya. This is from last year's slide. But we did talk a bit about Somalia and some of the areas there. So try and remember all that stuff that we talked about in class as well. And we are done.